A warm hello. My name is Raymond Lotta. I'm on the staff of Revolution Books here in Harlem, and we're very excited to welcome you to tonight's special program, How Fascism Works and How to Stop It, a dialogue with Andy Z and Jason Stanley. Tonight's program is presented in collaboration, and we're very excited about this, with the Brooklyn Book Festival 2020. Revolution Books here in Harlem and in Berkeley is a unique bookstore, a place where people come to wrestle with why the world is the horror it is and how it can be transformed through revolution. It's a place that values critical thinking, the poetic spirit, and the struggle for the truth. And it's a place whose beating heart is a radically new framework for human emancipation, the new communism developed by Bob Avakian. So I invite you to visit Revolution Books and to avail yourselves of our online resources, our specially curated selection of books, and our probing author programs. And I encourage you to support Revolution Books, to donate to our $15,000 fund drive. Support Revolution Books, a beacon for a whole new world. So let me introduce tonight's speakers. Jason Stanley is a professor of philosophy at Yale University, the author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us Against Them, and How Propaganda Works. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. Andy Z is the spokesperson for Revolution Books. He's the co-initiator of refusefascism.org, and he hosts the weekly RNL, Revolution Nothing Less show. So with that introduction, I hand the program over to Andy Z in Los Angeles.
All right, so welcome everybody online, different platforms, and welcome Jason Stanley.
How are you doing? Very much.
Okay, so we have a lot to talk about tonight. We had a lot to talk about yesterday before the so-called debate, and now we have even more evidence in front of us. The title of the program is How Fascism Works and How to Stop It, a dialogue. Can it happen here? Is it happening here? And what to do? So just for our viewers, how we want to go at this is we're each going to talk, make some opening remarks to set a framework, and then we're going to have a conversation about this. We had a chance to talk at Revolution Books right after How Fascism Works came out, and here we are a couple of years later, having traveled down this road. So why don't we start with you, then I'll speak a little bit, and then we'll have a conversation. And towards the end of the program, people can submit their questions in whatever platform they're on, and we will take a couple of questions at the end. Just to let people know, we're going to run until 8:30 sharp, and that's the framework for tonight. So you want to start, Jason?
Yes, thank you, Andy. So my book was published 2 years ago in September 2018. At the time, people charged me with alarmism. People said that, now I would like nothing more than to be wrong, than to have been wrong. However, I'm concerned that events have, if anything, vindicated the concerns that I was raising in my work. The reasons people gave for why I was being alarmist is they said things like, fascism requires an informal militia on the streets. It requires a relationship between the leader and militias on the streets. And we see no such development in the United States. We do not see white supremacist militias being organized to defend the fascist social and political movement. I think that's one case where we see that we were presented with a reason for why the call for the description fascism was overwrought, and I think that has been met. We saw yesterday in the debate Trump talking to the Proud Boys, telling them to stand down and stand by. There is clearly some kind of informal messaging going on between leader and militias. That's the concern here. Now, no one would like to be wrong more than me, let me add. So the second reason that people gave for why calls for fascism were overblown was that the president was not calling into question the democratic system. The president wasn't claiming that elections were rigged. The system was corrupt. The president was not saying that it's either me or the system is rigged. He wasn't directly attacking democracy. Well, I think we see that the president is directly attacking democracy. So again, I would like to be wrong. No one would like to be wrong more than me in this project. And I would like to go back to working on the semicolon or whatever god-awful things I used to do before this. However, that is not the situation in which we find ourselves. Third, the reason that people gave to say that my concern about incipient fascism was alarmist was that the president was not taking control of the party and taking control of the institutions of government. The institutions were supposedly still independent, according to the critics of my work. Fascism is a cult of the leader. It's a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of supposed threats by immigrants, minorities, and leftists. And people said, the Republican Party is not a cult of the leader. The Republican Party is not the same as Trumpism. We're not seeing the courts being taken over, the institutions being taken over by a cult of the leader, by devotion to the leader. There, too, my concern is that we have seen significant progress on that particular front. Now, I want to give you some conceptual tools with which to think through the topic of fascism. One thing people say is that, how can it be fascism if you, Jason Stanley, are not already in prison? It's true that if this was a pure fascist regime, I would be in prison. And so we do not have a pure fascist regime. We have, in fact, I would go as far as to say we live in a democracy whose institutions are threatened, whose voting system is deeply compromised historically and in the present. But it is still, by and large, a place where you can speak your mind, although that is slowly changing for academics, the president. But it is still the case you can speak your mind. You have a free press. Let's distinguish between a fascist regime, a fascist social and political movement, and fascist tactics. So my book, my 2018 book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, was actually about fascist tactics. What I was arguing was that there are fascists that all across the world. My book was not about the United States. It's about a worldwide movement that you see in Brazil, in India, in Israel. You see in a number of different countries, in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia. You see in many countries a fascist tactics being employed. Indeed, you see them being employed in liberal democracies that treat their immigrants migrants with horror, in placing them in horrific situations to try to encourage them to self-deport. This is a fascist tactic, but it's a fascist tactic we can see being employed in liberal democracies. So we can talk about fascist social and political tactics. And my book goes through 10 fascist social and political tactics, all of which I think we see employed here. For example, chapter 9 is called Sodom and Gomorrah. You represent the cities as dens of iniquity, is filled with foreigners and immigrants and leftists and crime and burning, and you run against the cities. That's what you run against the cities to draw a kind of anti-urban, anti-minority, anti-elite vote. We certainly see that tactic being employed in this election. So we can talk about fascist and social and political tactics, but we can also talk about a fascist social and political movement. And a fascist social and political movement can occur in a liberal democracy. Indeed, National Socialism was a fascist social and political movement occurring in a liberal democracy. So one question you need to ask yourself is Trumpism a fascist social and political movement? What would that mean? Well, is it a cult of the leader? Does Trump have a bond between himself and his supporters that is unbreakable? That is one that his supporters trust him over anything? Do you have in fascism only recognizes patriarchal authority. It only recognizes the authority of the leader. The leader does not, therefore, views all other kinds of authority, like scientific authority, as a threat to their leadership. So you have to ask yourself, is that what we're seeing now? Is the movement of Trumpism bound together by a conspiracy theory, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? So you have to ask yourself that. Are they saying that there are elites that are seeking to bring communism to the country, and are using immigration laws to try to flood the country with immigrants and destroy its character and bring homosexuality and depravity in to weaken traditional Christian faith, a la traditional, and that was like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Do we see such a conspiracy theory here? I would argue yes. We see Trumpism working in tandem with this sort of conspiracy theory. So you can have a fascist social and political movement in a country that is still a liberal democracy. It's going to take a lot for the United States to lose all vestiges of liberal democracy. If you look at Brazil right now with Jair Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro is pleading with the Brazilian military to place him as a military dictator, and the military is saying no thanks. So you can have a fascist social and political movement in a country whose institutions are still resistant, and one could be concerned that Trumpism fits the bill. So when people talk about fascism, that doesn't mean that you live in a country with a fascist regime. It means that you need to worry about a fascist social and political movement that employs fascist tactics. And when you have a fascist social and political movement, you need to look to the country's institutions. Do you have a quasi-military institution tied up with colonial wars, imperialist wars, that is devoted to distinguishing citizen from non-citizen, and can be used directed internally against political opponents? If you have such an institution, and arguably ICE fits the bill of such an institution, then you need to be concerned about fascist creep. That's not to say you live in under a fascist regime. It's to say you can intervene now with protests, with nonviolent protests, with organizing the vote, with bringing people to the polls, with creating alliances between different groups, between conservatives, progressives, to restore democratic norms. So when you say, oh, I'm worried about fascism, and people say, oh, you'd be in prison if this was fascism, you have to say back to them, I'm not worried about this being a fascist regime. I'm worried about there being a Trumpism, for example, being a fascist social and political movement. Now, before I hand it back to Andy, a couple more points. why would we need to be worried about fascism in the United States? And here I'm going, or I want to make two more points. First, people say, when you talk about fascism and you say Trump is a fascist, Trump is a fascist, Trumpism is a fascist social and political movement. People say, well, that, Trump isn't at all like, he isn't German or Italian, he's very American. Well, that's a conceptual error about fascism. All fascism must be local. All fascism is palingenic ultranationalism. It's a leader who says, I am the country, and I promise to restore the country's greatness. That leader must remind everybody in the country of the most. They must be the most archetypical member of that country. The fact that Trump, you couldn't be more American than President Trump, is not an argument that he isn't a possible fascist leader. It's an argument that he is a possible fascist leader. Relatedly, I want to underscore the Eurocentrism of the debate, of people who say, oh, it couldn't possibly be fascism because this isn't Germany or Italy. That's an extremely Eurocentric take. I do not think that Trump is much like Hitler at all. I don't think he threatens a genocide of minority groups, although the treatment of immigrants is a human rights violation of the first level, and we have normalized that in this country. But I think that the United States has been engaged in human rights violations against its black population for basically its entire existence. So Trump is not adding anything new, and he isn't particularly horrible on that along those lines. I don't think we need to turn to mid-century Europe to look for parallels here. I think we have plenty of parallels in the Americas, in Latin America. We have Latin American fascist movements. We have military dictatorships. We have autocracy. We have authoritarian regimes. We have Pinochet. If you look at, on the West Coast, in the right-wing rallies, at the T-shirts people are wearing, the T-shirts people are wearing are T-shirts that valorize the execution of political opponents under Latin American dictators. We need to look to that model, not to mid-century Europe. We need to look in the history of the United States to the white supremacist groups that Trump winks to in his comments. We need to look at Ku Klux Klan ideology, which strongly overlaps with National Socialist ideology, which says that there's a cabal, a globalist cabal, that's bringing immigrants in to destroy the white race. This is, that communists are using labor unions to advance to advance communism. That social justice is a mask to destroy Christianity. So we need to look for parallels in the Americas, and we need to look for parallels in the history of the United States itself. When people say, "Oh, but Trump is very American," that is an argument that he's a potential leader of a fascist social and political movement, not an argument against. And we don't need to make these analogies to Europe. All right, and with that, I will hand the microphone over to Andy.
Okay, well, thank you, Jason. I have to just start by saying I agree with you. And I think I even said this when we spoke after your book came out, that we were getting into, and I think I was a little bit coming at that point quite a bit, saying we had already formed Refuse Fascism, that this is fascism. And I said exactly what you said here. I'd never wanted to be wrong so much, but this is what we're facing. So look, I think what we'll do is I have some points that I'd like to make too. There's a lot of overlap. I'm in fact going to modify some things because I thought you touched a lot of things. I have to say, when I was rereading your book, How Fascism Works, I said, my gosh, so much of this has actually come to pass, as you just brought out. It was I guess on one level it's edifying, but it's also frightening and extremely serious. So here's what I want to say to people today that could frame our discussion. One, I'm going to make two overarching points that I hope people get out of our entire discussion. There'll be differences. There are differences between us on this, but it's differences within a framework. But my 2 points are, first, that we are in the midst of a rolling coup of the Trump-Pence regime. Okay, so, but we are in the midst of a rolling coup, and we saw part of that last night from Donald Trump. Second, now is the time that we have to act to prevent them from carrying this all the way through. So I will make a few more points that'll introduce this, that will frame our discussion or add points to it. And these bullet points are going to provide some framework for these two main points that I'm trying to make. First is, I do believe we are facing a fascist regime, and I'm saying that not to get into an argument over definitions, because I think actually when we parse this out, there's quite a bit of similarity, but there's probably a difference there too. But we are facing a fascist regime that has truly made horrific and momentous progress in bringing about and advancing a fascist America. This is a regime that is tearing up the rule of law. And at the heart of fascism is that. All the 10 characteristics in your book and more, all of this is part of fascism. But ultimately, to enforce the kind of world that Jason was just talking about in terms of the white supremacy, the patriarchy, the xenophobia, which means the hatred of foreigners, all of this can only be instituted with ultimately a change in the form of rule, where that rule is the rule of the leader. It is the rule of the fascist party, which is being forged through this Republican Party. But look, this is a regime that demonizes immigrants, black people, LGBTQ people, women, Native Americans, the media, and peaceful protesters. This is a regime that opposes science, as you brought out. This is leading to a country right now that is literally burning and drowning at the same time into unbelievable unnecessary death from COVID. And at the core of this regime is an unholy alliance between Trump and a Christian fascist movement that has been developing in this country for decades. And they are organized. They are organized up into the military. They have been organized up into the military. They're organized into police forces. They're organized into communities. And this is the core of this regime. This is the organization that people used to challenge you with, Jason, and say, well, where's the organization? Well, there's an organization there that nobody would have ever believed that Trump would come to head a Christian fascist movement. But that is actually what happened, and that is the Faustian bargain that they both made, and some of this is brought to bear in Michael Cohen's new book, Chapter 6. So there you go, a plug for that thug. But nonetheless, he's under fire. And Trump also unleashes, and you brought this out, in the basest white supremacist, racist heart of America in a way that we've seen before in this country. We can't forget that. But it's brought it to what used to be dog whistles are now for real. My second point is, yes, they have not yet fully consolidated fascist rule. That is true for now, but that should give us no comfort. That's my second point. Now, you can say that, as I understand, you're saying that a regime means fully consolidated fascist rule. I'm saying there's a regime there that has not consolidated the rule over the country. We can talk about if there's much meaning to that without going to the semicolon. 3, there is, as I said, a rolling coup that is barreling towards a showdown around the election. Trump is already stealing this election. He has a plan in place to use key institutions, the Supreme Court, violent thugs, in and out of uniform, to keep his regime in power. That is why it is so urgent that people take up, from many different points of view, the call that Refuse Fascism has put out to form a broad-based movement, Trump-Pence out now, a broad-based movement of many diverse political views that has one demand that crosses over, or put it differently, where every single demand, every single aspiration for a decent life has to go through removing this regime from power. For if it succeeds in power, all your dreams and aspirations for a decent life, for Black Lives Matter, for immigrant rights, for the climate, for not even be subjected to nuclear war. We can't forget that this man says if we have nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? All of this is why it's so urgent. We're 34 days away from an election. The Trump-Pence regime is undermining voting rights right now. What he lied about in the debate around what happened in Philadelphia, nonetheless, that he was thrown out, that his people were thrown out, is they went there to intimidate voters. The Christian fundamentalists have already organized 10,000 people to be poll watchers. He and his fascist groups said they're going to mobilize 50,000 former and in and out of uniform military and police to be poll watchers, which really means poll intimidators, and particularly against Black and Latino people. Third, this regime has repeatedly told us, and they've shown us, that they are preparing to stay in power by any and all means. That is the point at which Jason just warned of, that we're not at yet, but we could be. Last night, when Donald Trump was given the chance to say would he respect the election, he would not do it. He said the election will be a fraud and illegitimate. He is now, and as I just said, and he's called it out, and he called out his poll watchers in the debate. These are anti-Semitic and fascist and racist thugs. And he said that he will win this because he has stacked the courts. That was the meaning of what he said. Chris Wallace asked him this directly. Another example, we could talk about this for a long time today, of all the things that have shown him undermining the elections, which would ultimately be undermining those democratic institutions that people are counting on. His attorney general, he has turned into his private lawyer and the lawyer of the regime. He has backed up this whole campaign to delegitimize the election with false claims. He backed Trump up on all the stuff about the post office. I'm not going to take the time to go into that. People know about it. We can talk about it. He's threatened people who protest on the eve of the election, or rather on the election night, with sedition. This is a very serious thing. Why should we not take him seriously? Is there anything that's been indicated that this is a fascist tactic that could actually lead to fascist rule, should they actually do it? He's been defending Trump as the one ruler and not the rule of law. So look, I would say, just to make this point, bring this rolling coup point, there's every evidence that the Trump-Pence regime will not accept the election results if he loses. And his losing, by the way, is not a sure thing. Far from it. I'm going to get into that in my next point in a minute, but just think that all this stuff that Trump does is not just some madman talking, but this actually has a purpose. It demoralizes and it intimidates the opposition, including from going to the polls. Point 4, the Biden campaign and the Democratic Party leadership have told us and shown us that they are not going to fight Trump the way he needs to be fought. They want to play by rules that the Trump-Pence regime wants to and needs to shatter to bring about this program. The Democratic Party strategy is to appease swing voters in swing states, to be, as Biden said this last night, to be bipartisan with fascists, to conciliate and not take seriously nor mobilize the tens of millions who feel that we must act against the threats of Trump. And to be clear, Biden did not use the word fascist. He said, I will be president of all the people, of the Republicans and Democrats. But I would submit that that Republican Party has been so hollowed out and so dominated. They didn't even have a party platform this year. Their party platform was to support Trump, okay? That's a telling thing. My 5th point, and I'm going to be very brief on this, but it is really an emotional thing to think of what, if this regime stays in power, what this is going to mean for the people of the world and the people of this country. You know, it's almost unbelievable to me that we could be sitting here at this point in October almost of 2020 with tens of thousands of people in concentration camps on the border, COVID hotbeds with people being deported. I could walk through every single thing that this regime is doing, and that would take up our full hour and a half. I'll just leave it at that. Imagine a second term here and we should get into this. There actually will be, in my opinion, a genocide. I just want to say something about genocide, which means the killing of whole peoples. Actually, technically, it means even less than that, but ultimately, that's what it means. This country was founded on a genocide. Slavery was essentially a genocide. The betrayal of Reconstruction had genocidal elements. And then the new Jim Crow. It is a genocide to incarcerate 2.3 million people. And then what the police have done to people. I mean, for God's sake, imagine these people in power. Now, what I want to say about the genocide of the Nazi Germany in the Holocaust, that wasn't the plan that Hitler had, as you've spoken of yourself, Jason. The plan was to deport Jews, to get them out of Germany, and then eventually, as they expanded Germany, to get them on the other side, deep into Russia. But the exigencies of the war, the problems they ran into in the war, particularly against the then Soviet Union, led them at a certain point, fairly late in the game, 8 years into the game, before they took a decision to exterminate the Jews. Then one other thing I want to say about the reality of what a second term will mean for Trump, whether legitimate or illegitimately achieved, is Exhibit 1 would be Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines, and Exhibit 2 is what you began to see in Portland, where they went in with paramilitary forces loyal to the president, loyal to Attorney General Barr, and then when they were somebody who they had accused of shooting into this fascist mob that rampaged through town, they went in and executed him after Trump said, go do that. No trial, no indictment. Every aspiration people have for justice or for a decent world now has to go through removing this regime. I'm going to try and be brief in my last 2 points. If Trump doesn't win by a landslide on election day, they are preparing for everything I just said. They are preparing to take power by any and all means necessary. What does the history that we faced in the last 3 years tell us? That he doesn't do the things he says he's going to do? He's tried to do everything he said he would do, and he's succeeded at many of them. This is why we have to begin this fight right now. It is be too late to mobilize later on. Yes, people should vote in big numbers against Trump, which means voting for the Democratic Party candidate Biden. This is not a time for a protest vote, okay? This is a time to vote against Donald Trump. And if you don't do that, shame on you. This is going to be on you. But if we only rely on voting, it's going to be disastrous. And if we only wait to act till after Trump has stolen the election with his thugs in the street and his military or National Guard mobilized, you won't do it. And not only that, Biden told you last night not to do it. And the organizations who I hope to be seen in the public square this month, who have said they're not going to go out in the streets until after it's stolen. I want to tell you what Biden said last night. After telling the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by, this is what Trump's actually said, stand by, which can only mean we'll see how the election goes. So this is after I'm trying to shorten this now. He said that the ballots are going to, he would not say that he would honor the election. Let me just back up. He said he would not honor the election. He said there's thousands of ballots being manipulated. I can't go along with that. And he told his paramilitary, or rather his thugs, to stand by. But then Chris Wallace said, Vice President Biden, final question for you. Will you urge your supporters to stay calm while the vote is counted? And will you pledge not to declare victory until the election is independently certified? Okay, there's a little trap in there with the word calm. But essentially, Biden's answer was, here's the deal, his favorite phrase. The fact is, I will accept it, and he will too. You know why? Because once the winner is declared, and after all the ballots are counted, all the votes are counted, that'll be the end of it. That'll be the end of it. And if it's me, in fact, fine. If it's not me, I'll support the outcome. I'll be president, not just for the Democrats, I'll be president for Democrats and Republicans. Look, Biden was clearly saying to people, don't get out in the streets in major ways. I'm not saying that he won't say, stand guard outside or be outside a place where votes are being counted. But this is not a Sunday school exercise here. What Trump is preparing for is deadly serious. This is why what we're calling for is non-violent, sustained protest. All different views. I want to see never-Trumpers. I want to see Democrats. I want to see Bernie people. I want to see anarchists. I want to see my people, the revolutionary communists, out into the streets here and organizing this. So with that, I do want to just say that is the mission of Refuse Fascism. If I could just take 1 second more I will go into more of a conception of this, hopefully later on, but Refuse Fascism has put out a pledge that we just are releasing, and we're asking people from cultural figures to academics to all kinds of people to sign it. It's longer than I'm going to read, but I just want to read the end of it because I think it speaks to something that we both agree with. No longer can we live with howling mobs resurrecting Jim Crow, fascist thugs attacking our protests, the right to vote stolen by defenders of the Confederacy. We will not worship the flag or accept a theocracy. We will not become collaborators on a march to a racist genocide. We will not hand the future to scorchers of the planet. 4 more years, 4 more months, and it could be too late to change the course of history as the Trump-Pence regime sabotages the election and drags humanity to the edge of extinction. Here and now, we pledge to unite in our millions, rising together in nonviolent resistance to stop a great horror. We pledge to stay in the streets, overcoming fear and uncertainty until this American fascism is brought to a halt. We pledge our determination to prevail over a regime that imperils the people of the world and the earth itself. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. So, those are some points I wanted to make. I know we both went on a little longer, but we took, I think, a worthwhile half hour, 35 minutes to talk about this. So, before I ask you something, I just want to open it up to you. If you want to help frame what we should get into, that would be great.
Yes, so there's an issue raised by your remarks about how we think of Trumpism with respect to what you referred to as the long history of U.S. fascism. Sarah Churchwell, Bradley Hart, these are authors, these are some of the authors who've documented, Jim Whitman, my colleague Jim Whitman, these are some of the authors who've documented the long history of fascist ideology and fascist thought in the United States. It overlaps and is connected with the Ku Klux Klan, white supremacy, and the ideologies we're seeing today. It's baked into our system, as Black Lives Matter makes clear, with the prison industrial complex, the carceral state. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Black Americans are among the most incarcerated people in human history. So all of that preceded Trump. All of that preceded Trump. Is Trump a cause or is Trump a symptom? He's both. He's both a cause and a symptom. We'll never be able to address our long-standing problems as long as Trumpism is there. And as long as Trumpism is there, it's a reminder that these background conditions will always be there to enable a potential fascist leader. As Charles Lindbergh, the spokesperson for the America First movement, was viewed by the National Socialists, a potential American fascist leader. So we need to get at these underlying problems. For someone with my political leanings, which I'm putting aside to support Biden and Harris 100%. But for someone with my political leanings, the situation goes deeper than just our history of racism. It goes back to capitalism itself. Because with capitalism, capitalism unfettered is going to lead to fascism. Because capitalism unfettered will lead to an immiserated masses. And these immiserated masses will need to be entertained by cultural war against, they'll need to be set against each other with racial politics while their wallets are being stolen, while the taxes are being cut for the wealthy oligarchs that run things. The immiserated masses will need to be kept in their place by a powerful police force. You look at the NYPD's salary, how much the NYPD makes. It's, many, I think 11 billion, 6 billion, 11, some incredible amount of New York City's money goes into the NYPD. Police forces all across the country are being asked to play this role of adjudicating the social problems that come from class inequities. And I don't blame them. They're put in an impossible situation. They're put in an impossible situation to try to deal with the fact that a large portion of humanity in cities, mostly black and brown Americans, are immiserated and impoverished, while others are incredibly wealthy. So you're just going to see as more material inequality develops, as more jobs get outsourced to get automatized, get sent to robots to do, to AI. You're going to see more and more people enter a world of hopelessness, and you're going to need a powerful police state to control them, and you're going to need a cultural politics that sets them against each other. So we're going to need to deal with those problems. A Biden-Harris administration will need to deal with these problems. But in the first instance, we must stop the result of those problems. And the result of those problems is Trumpism. Trumpism is as American as apple pie. It harkens back when Trump calls for patriotic education. What is he calling for? He's calling for the kind of education that Du Bois denounces in the final chapter of Black Reconstruction. The chapter is entitled The Propaganda of History. And Du Bois denounces the way that education was historical education was explicitly set up to try to unify the South and the North, the white South and the white North, to try to obscure and hide the crimes of Reconstruction, of the end of Reconstruction. And make no bones about it, when Trump talks about patriotic education, when he targets Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project, the 1619 Project is incredibly patriotic. The 1619 Project is criticized from the left by being too patriotic. The 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones says, the American ideals are great, and Black Americans mainly realize them, which is inarguably true. That Black Americans had a central role in realizing American, or in helping to realize American ideals. But of course, she's a Black journalist, and she's calling attention to the history of Black Americans that is threatening to white Americans. That threatens, that it forces them to regard Black Americans as having an equal place, or having a deeply respected place. Black Americans are the vanguard of anti-fascism in the United States. So Trump has been attacking education. He threatened to remove federal funding from school districts that use the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project is not some radical project. Nicole Hannah-Jones begins her essay with talking about an American flag and how patriotic Black Americans are. It's incredibly patriotic. So what Trump is doing is he's returning us to this idea that Black Americans must know their place, and we must teach a history where Black Americans know their place. This is America's overlap with fascism. This is what I call in my book the mythic past. So we have this long history. We have rampant capitalism. We have the failure to deal with the financial crisis that is on Obama and Biden's shoulders. We have mutual culpability here. But this should be a gut check moment where Republicans, Democrats, anyone who believes, leftists like me, social conservatives, all of us who believe in democracy must bond together and say, no, we're not going to be threatening. I have very religious relatives. I want them to live their life as they want. I don't want their lives to be threatened. We have to make sure that our social conservative, that the extreme social conservatives, Christian conservatives, know that their lives are not being threatened. What we want to return to is a diverse, multicultural, multi-valued American democracy, and not white Christian fascism, which is frankly what threatens.
Yeah, look, I think that's, I agree with that. Actually, I did want to say James Whitman had been at Revolution Books, and you know, the other authors you spoke to are, it is important for people to look at that, and even in this history that people need to know. I think I don't know if it's an HBO series that took Philip Roth's book and made it into a series, is worth it for people. Yeah, The Plot Against America, for people to watch. I do want to come to where we're at right now, but just to back up a little bit, you raised a number of big issues that I just will speak to very briefly. It is true that at the root of fascism is the capitalist system. I do agree with you that it's a system that cannot possibly meet the needs of all of humanity. It's not how it's set up. It's a system that is developed historically. It developed historically alongside of feudalism and slavery, and actually was able to incorporate both elements into it, particularly in this country, which is that is the unholy union that began the country. As people know, we don't have time here to rehearse it all in terms of the founding constitution not only legitimating slavery, but not even allowing discussion of it for the first 20 years of the republic that so many people uphold. But fascism is one possible resolution of the contradictions that the people who rule this capitalist system face. And there is a very sharp divide at the top of society right now between those who want to basically continue the political order as it's been, maybe even expand it some. That was the content of the debate between the Bernie and Biden people, if you will. How do we make it more inclusive, make capitalism work for the people? Versus, on the other hand, the people who are behind Donald Trump and who he's come to represent exactly because he doesn't give a fuck about, or I don't know if I can say that, but give a damn about any of that in terms of, and he's willing to shatter the norms, who see that America needs to go back to those mythical values that you talk about, but actually the material reality of it was slavery. It was the tremendous exploitation and actually a demonization and oppression of immigrants, and that the country was actually founded on, and the oppression of women. All of this is built into the system, and really what you see developing here, and your book also points out this is developing around the world, is an apartheid state. An apartheid state is a fascist state, because you have a minority, and this exactly this cultural battle you were just talking about, that he actually said it straight up there, that it's unfair, the multiculturalism, it's unfair because it's discriminating against white people. And we could take the next literally 3 hours walking through the statistics and of the disparity between white and black people, white and Latino people, Latino and black people. We'd spend the whole day on it, and we wouldn't begin to touch what this means for people's lives, including COVID, that is disproportionately affecting Latino and black lives. So this is, we have a tremendous amount of unity there. In terms of the actual analysis of it, doesn't necessarily inevitably lead to capitalism. Capitalism doesn't necessarily inevitably, in my opinion, lead to fascism. It actually is a brutal dictatorship over the masses of people, even in the sense of not Trump barking out orders, but in the sense of people's lives being constrained by it. As you just talked about the carceral system, we have just one of the most egregious caste system and mass incarceration. But in one sense, I want to speak to it, but I want to actually talk a little bit about, I have so many questions for you, Jason. So many questions. But one, I do want to get to this question of how what has been a slow genocide against black people, the reaction of Trump and what he's fomented among these. Look, the white fascist mobs are a certain size, but there's 40 million people who are supporting this. All right, maybe it'll turn out to be 38 million. That is a heavy, heavy thing that people have to recognize. And depending on how things develop in the world, that could turn into a faster genocide. The genocidal impulse in this is not something trivial. even what's happening on the border now, I mean, I don't know how anybody could say, well, it's only 60,000 people and live with themselves. I don't know how anybody can deal with what's been happening to deporting people into COVID hotbeds in Central America and live with themselves. To me, it's a shameful expression of individualism and self-involvement for people not to see the human cost of it. And the history I grew up with and you grew up with of what happened to the Jewish people was the exact same thing. People putting up with it because it didn't affect them. So that's a little side point here, but it's actually at the heart of this. So I do want to get to this genocidal impulse and that's there. And it's not to say it's inevitable that there'll be ovens in March if he succeeds, but there is a way this will take place, and it will take place in an American context, and in response to necessity problems that the Trump-Pence regime runs into. Let me pack in another question here just to make things more complicated. But you speak a lot about, and your book is about, and your work is about the influence of language and ideology on people, how people think. I'd actually like to talk a little bit about how the overall public discourse has been changed. Certainly what used to be said in dog whistles are now said openly by the Trump fascist regime. But also the more liberal progressive strata has come to tolerate a language and to accept things being said that would have been unacceptable. I mean, my parents weren't people who hit me, but they would have slapped me in some way if I just looked the other way when shit was happening to people in the South in the 1960s when I grew up. That was not allowed in my house. You couldn't go along with that. You had to say something. And then, I didn't like that. I didn't think they did enough, but nonetheless. So I'm packing two questions together in terms of the seriousness of what we face in terms of the lives of the masses of people. And it makes me very angry when people say, oh, the institutions are going to hold, because when they don't hold, then people die in massive numbers.
Good. I mean, not good. Good points. When we talk about, history doesn't ever exactly repeat itself,
right?
But it plays similar. And if we look at the consequences of right now, if we look at the consequences of the choices that will be made at the polls and what they will be for human life, we have two enormous risks. The first is climate change. It's not too late, but we need to act very quickly. The world cannot afford another 4 years of climate change in action. And make no mistake, this administration, Jair Bolsonaro's administration in Brazil, these are nihilistic ideologies that seek, that almost embrace a kind of self-destruction, and that too is fascist in its nature. I mean, Hitler's nihilism was enacted with the insane desire for world domination. Bolsonaro and Trump's nihilism seems to be enacted with the desire for world destruction with climate change. When I was in Brazil in March, speaking at a literary festival with some leading journalists, I said, well, I'm sure that the big agriculture companies want Bolsonaro to clear the Amazon. And the journalist I was in conversation with said, actually, that's not true. Brazilian farmers, they support Bolsonaro 100% because his whole politics is about how the cities are decadent, the farmers are my base, or the cowboys, but they do organic farming and they make a lot of money off sustainable farming. Bolsonaro seems to be destroying the Amazon for its own sake as this kind of nihilism. And similarly with Trump's environmental policies, seems to be poisoning the air, the water, the earth. We do not have time. These wildfires in the complete denial of science, the complete denial of reality. This mirrors the complete denial of reality that we saw with fascist leaders of the past, thinking they could conquer Russia, rule the world, enslave the world. That's what we're seeing now, this idea that, this complete denial of reality. And if we look at the number of bodies that may result from this, the body count might be very similar as to fascist movements in the past. So that's where I see this danger coming. Because people are right to say that the Obama administration brutalized immigrants, not to this level, not anywhere near to this level, and don't let anyone tell you this. This is unprecedented, what's happening under Trump. But the Obama administration was not the deporter-in-chief, he was called. They were not great. The prison industrial complex is a long-standing feature of the United States. But, climate change is the most important issue humanity faces. And on that, we're seeing, we can talk about genocide. And there might be no comparison with the past in terms of the bodies, in terms of the destruction. So that's number one. Number two, about language. So language is completely changed. We've normalized it. So it was key to understand American politics before Trumpism. It was key to understand the notion of plausible deniability. Somebody would talk, Paul Ryan would talk about makers versus takers, or inner city, the problems of the inner city. And people would say, that's racist. And they would say, no, it isn't. I'm just talking about the middle of cities, But now what we've got is implausible deniability, just a blatant lying, which is a complete power move. So Trumpism, a fascist social and political movement, involves a relationship between the leader and the supporters, where the leader can openly lie, and it pleases the supporters. It pleases the supporters because this kind of politics is a politics of what the philosopher Susanna Siegel pointed out, of schadenfreude, a delight in the pain of one's enemies. Timothy Snyder calls it sadopopulism. The desire is to see, Trump, their leader is getting away with it. Their leader is openly lying. Their leader is openly cheating. He's doing it for them. He's doing it for them. He's getting away with it. It just shows his power. And it's all about power. This kind of politics is all about power. What we need to do is we need to return this United States to a rule of law state. And then once it's a rule of law state, we can adjudicate our political differences. But right now, you've got a situation where Trump doesn't lose any supporters by blatantly lying. At the debate yesterday, when he just said, he blatantly said, the New York Times got hold of his tax returns. The tax returns showed $750, that he paid $750 in 2016, 2017. And he blatantly just said, no, that's wrong. I paid millions and millions of dollars. So openly lying, he lied throughout the entire debate. His supporters don't care. He can, this way of, the talk of cities as burning, violent crime is at near historic lows. The murder rate has gone up in many cities, not Democrat-led cities. It's gone up more in Republican-led cities. But the murder rate has gone up, but it's still nothing like New York City in the 1990s. Nothing. There were 2,300 murders in New York City in 1991. There were around 300 last year. Maybe it will go up to 500, which is a human tragedy, but it's still a quarter. I doubt it will go up to 500 murders this year, but it's still a fraction of the murder rate that we had in the 1990s. And he's representing the cities as, that's how this politics works. You represent the cities in this way as sort of, so what we've got is we've got this, and now we've got the open conspiracy theories. We've got many Republican candidates running for Congress who are fans of QAnon. QAnon looks a lot like some mixture of the Nazi conspiracy theory, Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and blood libel. Blood libel was so conspiracy theories end up being anti-Semitic. And we have to remember that anti-Semitism, the Nazi anti-Semitism, was not directed against religious Jews in the first instance. It was directed against Judeo-Bolsheviks, leftist Jews. And the idea was communism was a Jewish plot. So what we have now is we have Republicans using classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and then saying, but look, I'm pro-Israel. But look, the Orthodox Jews support us. Well, hey, Nazi anti-Semitism was never directed against Orthodox, was not in the first instance directed against Orthodox Jews. It was directed against secular Jews like me, against liberal Jews. And of course, many Orthodox died by not realizing they were in its targets. But that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing open conspiracy theories, and we're seeing a presidential administration devoted to trying to reconstruct these conspiracy theories by showing that there's a deep state plot. We're seeing a fascist propaganda where you call your enemy what you are.
Right.
So you're the corrupt one. You're the you're the criminal administration. And then above all, we're just seeing this idea that we're seeing fascist law and order. What is fascist law and order? Fascist law and order is when what the leader wants is the law. So the entire RNC was a Hatch Act violation, was illegal. But it was a blatant way to show off the leader's power. And we have to somehow get away from those politics, get away from the thrill people have of seeing their leader dominate the opposition and cut their health care and cut their union benefits and cut their cut the taxes of the wealthy. But as long as their leader is getting his, they're happy. We have to get away from that politics.
Yeah, I just want to come to just a couple of questions, because I think the people who've been listening to us for this last hour, 10 minutes, have found a picture of a quite pleasant and rosy world being painted for them, and it is actually quite a serious situation, as I know you understand and are also out there on this. Out there telling people the actual truth here. I want to just go into just a couple of things in terms of what is to be done about this right now and why it's so urgent that we actually take actions in the streets across all kinds of political and ideological and gender and national divides. It's really, the future does depend on it. I said this was a rolling coup. What that means is that step by step, the rule of law is being torn asunder. What it means is that norms that people, civil norms, which you've just spoken about, civil norms, how people relate to each other, they're being shredded. People talk about this. You see this in supermarkets, in Walmarts. It means that what you've counted on before does not exist any longer. And the Trump-Pence regime, before it even was in power, Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani said, and expressed what was said privately in their ranks, that they viewed this being the Trump-Pence regime was their last chance to bring about the worldview that they had. And there was a very coherent worldview expressed in this Christian fascist movement, and there were other strains of fascism that have all congealed around Donald Trump. This they saw, and not completely inaccurately, but mainly inaccurately, was their last chance. And it doesn't matter whether that was accurate or not. That's what they actually believe, and that's what they're acting on. And so we face a situation with this election. In order for them to stay in power, they will do whatever it takes. Now, whether or not anybody's going to stop them, we've been through this over the last 3-4 years. Oh, the responsible adults in the room are going to stop this, the 3 generals. They did not. Oh, The Mueller report's going to do that. He did not, and in fact, there's plenty of evidence coming out now that he basically threw the case, which is not surprising because he did the same thing with the NFL years ago. But every step of the way, the blue wave, that's going to save us. No, it didn't. So, but people want to hold on to something. They want to hold on to an illusion. They don't do what needs to be done. We had at one of our rallies, Refuse Fascism's rallies last week, was around the 200,000 death mark being met in Chicago. We did them around the country, but in Chicago, a professor from the College of Charleston, Joshua Shanes, I don't know if you know him or not, but Joshua Shanes, he also studied fascism. He made the point that, there's no predetermined point where it becomes too late. But it does become harder and harder and harder to stop. And the longer you wait, the more death and destruction takes place. And, we're not going to take the time now to get into this discussion of, well, it was really 1938 when it was, that's with Kristallnacht in Germany, that's when it became too late. No, really, it waited till 1941. Well, actually, I think it was 34. It became increasingly difficult for there to be resistance. And actually, anything after 1938 would have been extremely difficult to stop. Right now, we believe we still have time. We have a lot of what I've been speaking about comes from a pamphlet that was issued on August 1st by Bob Avakian on the immediate critical situation, the urgent need to drive out the fascist Trump-Pence regime, voting in this election, and the fundamental need for revolution. But the thing about this pamphlet is it really goes into the fundamental change. The heart of this fascism is, as you were just talking, when there's no longer a rule of law, then all the things, if you're an immigrants' rights activist, if you're a Black Lives Matter activist, if you're working on the climate, everything you've been working for, that gets wiped off the books. If you're a person who's not an activist, you're just, I have some relatives I'm mad at, they retreated to Vermont, right? And they're not doing anything. But they think they're going to live a nice life. Well, I can give you a witness of plenty of people, including your family, who did get out, but who didn't get out because they thought this would blow over. We both know how many Jews returned to Germany in 1934 because they thought this couldn't possibly happen in the liberal democracy of Germany. So this is why we are calling for, Refuse Fascism is calling for, let's get in the streets now, nonviolent, sustained protest. In the beginning, this is going to be like a town square. I don't know if it'll start some city with 12 people, some people hundreds, maybe other 1,000 people. Far insufficient. But it'll be a place people can come. They're going to talk. They're going to get materials. They're going to have to develop forms of organization with people who've never worked together before because these fascist thugs are going to come by. We've already had that situation develop here in Los Angeles where the fascists have said they're going to come to this first day of this protest. So we'll have to be serious. We'll have to reach out to communities. We're going to be marches, for example, around Black Lives Matter that we hope will come to the square and that will leave from the square and go up. But we have to get to a situation where it's not just tens of thousands of fascist poll watchers who are intimidating people, but where there's masses of people saying, we don't want to live like this. Joshua Shanes was quoting another fascist scholar who studied a particular town in Germany. He said in the 30s, he said, the thing that was missing is there was not a united front of the decent people. Yeah.
Thalberg.
I think that's who it was. Not a united front of the decent people. That's what we actually need. And I think that this is something that is so urgent right now. And sure, Biden wins by a landslide, Trump says, see you later. Okay, then we got a different set of contradictions, different set of problems we got to deal with. But if you're banking on that, you're not paying attention to what's happening right now. And the even worse horror that could come, I completely agree with you on the climate. I also think it's a horror for immigrants and black people on a scale unimagined. I also think it's a horror on COVID. I also think that the world is not standing still for Donald Trump. And there's going to be things that are going to mature. And this is somebody who has said, if we have nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? People should be very frightened on the one hand of what could happen, but very buoyed by the fact that there is a way still to stop this. Yes, vote in massive numbers, but if we're not in the streets, it's not going to happen. As you know, and as people know who follow our show, I think ultimately to get rid of these problems, we need an actual revolution for this new communism. But right now, everybody has to get out in the streets, and it is a fact that every progressive change that has come in this country has come through the struggle of masses of people. That is when things have changed. It's not come because somebody, LBJ didn't just do what he did around the Civil Rights Act because he was just an anti-racist, far from it. It's because there was a massive movement in the streets, and actually that was threatening to get way out of control. So I think I'd just like to talk a little bit about this, because I don't want to put you on the spot of endorsing this or something, but I think the need for people to act is historically accurate and necessary.
Yeah. I don't think it's the strategy the Trump administration seems to be following is to try to convince people that election day will decide things. We know what they've done. It's actually quite remarkably James Bond villanesque. What they've done is they've convinced their supporters that COVID is not to be taken seriously. So if you look at the people who plan on voting on election day in person, they massively favor Trump. Then if you look at the people who plan to vote by mail, they even much more massively favor Biden. So what they're going to do is what the plan seems to be is to declare victory on election eve. And say, well, it's the end of the election, and before the votes are counted. And then, so what we have to do is we have to think not in terms of election day, but in terms of election month. It's going to be a while before the full results are in. And Biden will have to win by a lot in order to and I think he will win by a lot as long as we get everyone we know out to vote. But we have to be on the streets because they will try to steal the election using the fact that they have a large same-day, in-person voting election advantage. So we absolutely need to be on the streets. There needs to be that political pressure. I think what you're seeing, however, which is frightening but shouldn't dissuade us, is we're seeing police across the country practice tactics on nonviolent protesters. They're practicing provoking them into action. They're practicing, I'm sure you've seen this, Andy, I'm seeing videos of police seizing people on the streets and gatherings that make no sense other than practicing.
I think that's really true. No, yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So,
yeah. Well, this is why. Look, and this does speak to, we don't have to. This does speak to why we are trying to get this going now. It's not going to be easy to deal with this. The game has already changed. This is what you're speaking about, the way they're coming at protesters now. The game has changed, and it's not a, look, when the Attorney General says we're going to charge people with sedition if they protest on election night, it would be wise to take that seriously, including that they're going to be out these thugs are going to be out in massive numbers. You can't assemble a movement overnight. And just meeting in little conclaves now on Zoom to plan for that, that's fine. We should do that. People should do that. But we have to gain experience together out in the streets. And people have to understand this is going to be nonviolent, very broad protests. From the very beginning, Refuse Fascism has said, one demand, Trump Pence out now. Bring all your other demands, your other signs, your feelings, your aspirations for, whatever. But this has to start now, and so that by the time the election comes, our side, which is very broad now, the people who don't want this fascist regime to continue feel the confidence, even to go to the polls, even to go to the polls. There will be no landslide if there isn't this force out there, the more that they get their forces out there. So I did want to bring that with that point out. I don't know about now questions. Do we have anything that's come in that's particularly, I mean, I would be willing for people have questions for me that we can answer them in another forum. I think we're at an important point in the conversation where we're going to want to wrap up. But is there a particular important question?
There's the questions that you got on rolling coup.
Okay, well, this one we already answered.
And then there's one more about it'd be interesting to know how it made the leap from secular progressive Jews to all Jews in the historical record.
Okay, so that's we're not going to answer that now. But somebody asked the question: how did the move go from secular progressive Jews to where Jews are at now?
No, in the Nazi.
Oh, in the Nazi, just in the Nazi period.
Started targeting a narrow swath of Jews and then expanded to all.
Okay. We can maybe answer that briefly. We could also refer people to Why the Heavens Did Not Darken by Arno Mayer, I think speaks to some of that. But if you want to answer briefly, because I would like to go one more place on this.
There's a nice piece by Eliyahu Stern in Tablet magazine called Orthodoxy and Anti-Semitism in the Age of Trump that I think people should, yeah.
Okay, well that's...
What's happened, and it talks about the history, it talks about the two different traditions of Judaism, the secular progressive tradition and the traditional Orthodox position, and the different versions of anti-Semitism directed against them. But the idea that Jews are a global communist force seeking to bring communism to the world, that's not directed against Orthodox Jews, who clearly wanted no part in that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the kind of anti-Semitism we're seeing today. And then we see the Trump administration say, see, it's not anti-Semitism because the Orthodox Jews support us. But it is anti-Semitism.
The other questions that came in, one was what is a rolling coup? I think I can say I gave examples of it before. What it means is that right now, as Jason said at the beginning, there is still two houses. There's still we're going to vote. There is supposed to be a contested election, right? But as we've seen, Trump said that he's not accepting that it be a contested election and would abide by the results, and there's no reason to expect that he's not going to try to do that. There's a rolling coup in this case from Refuse Fascism specifically means that over the last period of time, we've seen step after step after step that has taken away, stripped away essential democratic norms and rights, and specifically focused around the election. I wanted to say this. This will be a little bit longer point. I think people should imagine two different things that are not nice to imagine. Then we can imagine some things that are nice to imagine, which Jason said before, what we would begin to do after Trump leaves, if he does leave, including that there'll be a lot of struggle amongst each other. What is the way that we could actually have a world fit for human beings where humanity as a whole could flourish, not just some people in one country, but people all over the world? We'll have differences among ourselves, and we'll certainly have differences with the people who are enforcing this world. Because as Jason brought out earlier, mass incarceration existed before Donald Trump, as did deportation. But I wanted people to imagine two things that are not, maybe people don't go to. Imagine a second term of Donald Trump, even one legitimately. Just imagine that, unrestrained at that point, and then wanting to develop successors to that, feeling vindicated with a Congress, with a Supreme Court that is 6-3 of essentially Christian fascists. They're not all fascists, but they're pretty much on board with that. But a Christian fascist court, essentially, just think about what that's going to mean to masses of people, including that the world isn't standing still. The kinds of things that are going to happen. Are the police now going to stop killing people? No, they're not. What happens when people protest and he's vindicated? That's why I said people should look at what's happened in Modi. Modi, who's the president in India, he was reelected, and right away he basically shut down an entire province under martial law, cut off their internet. He declared millions and millions of Muslims who'd lived in the country for a long time non-citizens. That's under that scenario. But imagine, here's my second imagine, and try to be brief here. The second imagine is, if Trump stays in power because he's able to delegitimize the election, he first contests the mail-in ballots. Then they take it to courts in various states. And then you start seeing this go to state legislatures. I'm not going to walk through all this stuff. There's a study been done on this. People can look it up. There's a major article in The Atlantic on this. But imagine all the things that he would do to change the rules of the game, backed up and enforced by these thugs in the street, as well as these paramilitary ICE people that he's developed, the National Guard, and a police forces that are acting often in contradiction even to their own commanders locally. I mean, these police unions are very tied into the fascist base. Does anybody really believe that if he stays in power that way, that he is going to rescind anything that he's done through the course of November 3rd to January 20th? If he's able to get a ratification for an election that is essentially stolen, this is something people should think about, because that will be, we might have Jason Stanley on without his picture on saying, you know what, it is a fascist regime as he was defining it at the beginning, because it could be very, very different world. And the last thing I want to say,
let me be clear about fascist creep that we need to pay attention to. So the war on terror created certain institutions, imperialist institutions, that were devoted to rooting out potential terrorists among immigrants. What we've got is a transformation of those institutions that were already prepared to deal with the utmost harshness with immigrants, we had Muslims being vilified. If we look at the war on terror, we look at Trump's first actions, the Muslim ban, we now have that institution being directed against political opponents. It used to be that this institution was hunting out immigrants, Mexican and Latin American, Latino immigrants, Latinx immigrants. Now they're being explicitly redirected against leftists. That should concern every American. That's a first they came for moment.
yes.
Once you have this institution directed against leftists, once you have the universities, the press, the education system being targeted, which Trump is being very explicit about, well, then we're talking about genuine transformation, and I fear that's what we're facing. Political opponents being targeted. Trump talked about radical professors and of course teachers. So we have that. But what deeply worries me, one of the things that deeply worries me is the use of these war on terror institutions now being deployed against political opponents and peaceful protesters.
That's a very important point, and it actually makes, if I can just be a little more explicit on my point, the Patriot Act, various measures that were instituted after 9/11, which was the World Trade Centers coming down, all this for people who were not even born then, and who've been in the streets lately. None of them went away afterwards. They've all stayed in power. in force, rather. This is the thing we have to look at, that when we say rolling coup, if he is able to do what he says he's going to do, it's going to be a whole different game. You see, here's a funny thing. People say, well, we got the courts, we've got the legislature, it's all what it is. Well, you do until you don't. And in fact, what fascists always do, and I think you've pointed this out, but certainly others have as well, fascists prefer to keep these institutions. What they do is they hollow them out and put their own people in it and change the rule. Even in the institutions that I'm sure we both have, I have a very fundamental criticism of the CIA, the FBI. These people are tremendous fascistic forces in this country from the time they were formed. And yet, they're not fascistic enough for the Trump-Pence regime. In other words, they are going through there and purging them and putting them with loyalists. I know we're coming to the end of our time. I want to just, somebody said, why are famous actors and singers and not calling people into the streets? Well, that's your job, people. You got to get out in the streets. You got to get out in the streets and they'll come, okay? Some of them have done, the athletes in particular have been outstanding in what they've done in the NBA and WNBA and tennis. But, you know, you can't rely on them. You've got to get out there. When they see you out there, they will be there. So, you know, I'm going to give you a last word. I do want to say that about Jason I said, boy, I'd really, when Trump gave his acceptance speech and all the mythology that he put at the end of that speech, just the absolute 1950s, but the whole American bullshit origin story, I said, I didn't get to talk to you, but we do on our new episode of Revolution Nothing Less show tomorrow night have a filmmaker who did the movie Sir No Sir, has done a sequence where he's had Trump's words up against the reality of the genocide of the native people. It's an incredible 8-minute segment. So I do want to encourage people to get out in the square, to go to refusefascism.org, go to Revolution Books NYC. You can order books online. You can support the bookstore. There's also revolutionbooks.org or .net in Berkeley. Support both of those, and go to revcom.us to find out about the Movement for an Actual Revolution. But I want to give Jason another word, and then I'll just say good night after that.
Okay, so I think democracy is unusual. Democracy is unique. Most countries live under some form of authoritarianism, some kind of banana republic dictatorship. Democracy only works if we all are devoted to it. We have differences amongst each other. Some of us are religious Christians or religious Muslims or Jews. Others are secular, humanist secular. Some are gay, some are straight. We come from different paths. But a democracy is about us all living together and being devoted to that system. I truly believe we face a moment where we are risking this system. I think this isn't going to be good for anyone, even those who think they will gain from it. Let's get out there on the streets peacefully. Let's not give any photo ops for the opposition, for further recrimination and crackdowns. Let's get people to the polls, get young people to the polls, get everyone to the polls, and let's remember, this isn't going to be election day. It's going to be election week or election month. See you on the other end.
Okay, I think that's an important message. I want to say to people, you know, when Jason just spoke of all the different kinds of people who need to be involved and the differences over how we would eventually get to a just world, what better way to begin to have that dialogue and debate than standing together against what would be a great horror? You know,
Yes.
I look forward to... Okay, I'm going to end with this. I look forward to you being on this show after Trump is gone and we can have a big argument about revolution or this. But for now, be well and stay safe and keep spreading the word about fascism, Jason. Thank you for doing this program with Revolution Books. And good night to everybody who's watching.
Support your